Right, good morning everybody. I make that 10 o'clock, so we'll make a start. Welcome to September's edition of Audit and Governance. My name is Councillor Matthew Hall and I am Chairman of the committee. Agenda item 1, we will go through a roll call of members. Officers, when you come to your point on the agenda, can you please just introduce yourself the first time you speak? So first of all, Councillor Susan Cocking.
Sorry. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Oh, sorry, Councillor Susan Cocking, representing Portland. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Councillor Rod Atkins.
Good morning, Chair. Rod Atkins, Ferndown South.
Morning, Rod. Councillor Janet Dover.
Good morning, Chair. Councillor Janet Coal Hill, Listed.
Morning, Janet. Councillor Barry Gorringe has sent his apologies. Councillor Mike Parks, are you there? I think Mike will be joining us. He was just on a phone call just a short while ago. Councillor Bill Pipe. Have that as a no. Councillor John Orell, are you there this morning?
Hello, yes, Councillor John Orell, Melcombe Regis, Weymouth.
Good morning, John, and welcome to the committee. For fellow members, just to let you know that Claire Sutton, for a variety of reasons, has stood down from this committee and John Orell is taking her place. We've had apologies from Councillor Bill Trite and finally Councillor Richard Biggs.
Richard Biggs, member for Dorset, Poundbury and Vice Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Agenda item 2, members, any declarations of interest?
No.
Agenda item 3, public participation. I'm not aware of any. Is that the case, Judy?
Chairman, that's correct. We have no public questions today.
Morning, Susan. Apologies.
Morning. You're welcome.
Right, main part of the agenda is agenda item 4, which is the internal audit progress report by SWAP. I believe that's over to you, Sally White.
Thank you, Chair. I think Rupert would like a brief word first.
Go on then, Rupert, we'll let you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I'm Rupert Bamberger from SWAP Internal Audit Services, currently acting as the Head of Internal Audit for Dorset Council. Just very briefly, if I could, before we go into the SWAP paper, if I could just quickly update on some SWAP staffing changes for the committee. So recently I was fortunate enough to secure a more centrally focusing role within SWAP, but this obviously meant I would not be able to continue my Head of Internal Audit responsibilities for Dorset Council from the end of this month. So after a recent sort of recruitment campaign, really pleased to announce that the new Assistant Director for SWAP covering Dorset Council and this committee will be Sally White. So I hope you agree this is a fantastic appointment. Sally will obviously be able to bring her extensive experience and knowledge of Dorset councils and obviously ensure continuity for Dorset Council as a sort of contact for officers and members. So congratulations to Sally from me, and with that, Chair, I'll hand straight over to Sally for her presenting SWAP's paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert, and thank you very much, Chair. Yes, this is our second formal update for this financial year, but as you know, members are able to access our live rolling audit plan document at any point to see what audits are in progress and what we're waiting to start, etc. We also now have added an action tracker, which enables senior officers and members to see the progress that services are making in implementing agreed actions. We do have a training session booked for after this meeting, and this will be an opportunity for members to learn more about how to access these documents for yourselves and what the documents are showing you. Our interim opinion at this point of the year is reasonable. And since our last update, we've issued 2 limited assurance opinions for disclosure and barring, service checking, and also for early years funding. You'll find those reports in Appendix A of the report, and these will provide you with an overview of the outcomes of that work. On page 2, you will see the table that's hopefully starting to become more familiar to you. This is an extract at a point in time from our rolling audit plan document and details our audit coverage across the key risks of the council. As you'll see, there are still a few gaps where we're not able to provide assurance, as we've not done any work in those areas as yet. And we're starting work putting together a map of other assurance mechanisms that might plug some of those gaps. As that assurance map matures, we will then be able to see whether there are council-wide assurance gaps rather than just internal audit assurance gaps. Moving on to page 3, you will see that we've enhanced our performance measures page by including financial savings that we've identified both since our last report and as a cumulative total across the current financial year. When we undertake our work, we're not necessarily focused on finding financial savings, and these are often a fortuitous byproduct. You'll then see below that a couple of graphs that detail the number of overdue priority 1 and 2 actions, and you can see from the first graph how, since we've implemented our new follow-up process, that we started with 62 overdue actions in May, which had reduced to 39 by mid-August and stands at around 33 today. The other graph shows those overdue actions but split by directorate, and we're making some really good progress in bringing down these long overdue actions. Page 4 provides a rundown of added value and includes more around our financial savings, details a couple of surveys that we've undertaken, talks about how we are developing and embedding our processes of continuous auditing, and highlights how we're facilitating the council's use of the SciFast fraud database for the employment of agency staff. Finally, on page 4, we provide some information around how we've helped to support the council in the early stages of developing an authority-wide value for money framework, which I understand is also included in today's agenda. And finally, in Appendix A, this shows the 2 limited assurance reports. That's all the highlights from me. As always, happy to answer any questions that members might have.
Thank you, Sally. Members, if you have any questions, can you please put RTS in the chat bar? Just a quick thing, Rupert, thank you very much for all your work that you've done with Dorset Council, and wish you every success with your new position. And thank you, Sally, and it's good to have the continuity. Thank you. First question comes from Councillor Susan Cocking.
Thank you, Matt. I just have a couple of questions. What are the reasons behind the gaps on page 2? You're saying that you've been unable to do the work for a variety of reasons. Is that you haven't been able to access the data, or is it due to staff shortages, or what's the reason behind not being able to get the data for them?
In terms of the gaps on the coverage page, that really is down to the fact that we do have limited resource. There is only so much that we can cover as part of our internal, our annual internal audit sort of plan. And as I highlighted, our assurance mapping process will also look to identify what other assurance mechanisms already exist within the council. So, mechanisms that you might be able to rely on to provide assurance to members and senior officers of the council. So we may not necessarily need to do any work in those areas, but once, as I said, that map starts to mature, we will be able to identify where those gaps are, and then where there are gaps, we can sort of, look to plug those with audit assurance for members.
Okay, thank you. And I just have another question, if that's okay, Chair. On page 4, financial savings, how did this happen that people have actually been able to claim overtime on nursery? Was it an extra, or was it £2,150, and it equates to £10,291 of debt? How did this account within a checking checks in progress to check that people weren't double claiming for overtime. Just wondered how this occurred.
Just to clarify, this isn't staff claiming overtime. This is free nursery provision for 2, 3 and 4-year-olds.
Yeah.
And it's the nurseries that have overclaimed. There is a possibility, I mean, whilst we describe it as overclaiming, they do have a constant turnover of children, so there will always be a churn, so there will be instances where the claim contains children that have then subsequently left the nursery, so there is a need for constant adjustment. So whilst we've identified that as an overpayment, we don't see that as a particularly serious issue. The £10,000 was around debt that had built up from providers that had then stopped delivering the service, and that debt wasn't actually part of the council's debt recovery process, but obviously we have made we've agreed an action around that, and that will change going forward.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Susan. Next question from Councillor Biggs.
Yeah, it's on a similar basis to the previous question, the first question, around some of the gaps, really. I suppose my only concern is that what I would consider some of the biggest issues facing the council, or facing probably the rest of the country, you know, would be climate change, Brexit, emergency response. You know, it's really useful, I would have thought, to actually, you know, I know we're in a state of emergency response at the moment, but that must be tailing off now. But it would be really useful to do a detailed lessons learned, because across the country, you know, emergency planning departments have been slashed to a fraction of what they were, you know, 10 years ago, and yet we seem to be facing more of these, you know, these problems, these risks coming at us from all directions. And we probably really need to know, you know, how effective they are and where we need to add capacity to that area. And Brexit is obviously feeding into inflationary pressures, etc., and the shortages, contributing to some of the shortages we're getting with our fuel supplies, etc. So just an indication of when those, or are they going to be completed this year, and are they going to be, as you say, covered by some other sort of monitoring mechanism? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, if I could just start with the climate change. We definitely do have something in our backlog on climate change, and we could look to bring that forward. Certainly, if you think that that would be useful to do. Emergency response, we don't yet, but that's certainly something that we could perhaps look to talk to Mark Eyre about, because obviously that's an area that sits with Mark. And Brexit, yeah, again, that's possibly something that we could talk to John Salgren around, if you feel that that would be helpful, and then we could possibly come back to you on that. Although I think from a council perspective, I know it's obviously come back into the news in the last sort of few weeks, but I know that from a council perspective, I think it was felt that the risk was sort of somewhat lower on Brexit now, but we can sort of go back and discuss that with John.
Did you want to come back on anything, Richard, before I get Aidan to come on in?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously my personal thoughts. I just wonder what the rest of the committee feel. I just think some of those need, certainly the emergency planning response, etc. I think it's definitely something that we should, but I'm sort of more relaxed on some of the others, but because I think they're probably covered off.
Thanks, Richard. Aidan, did you want to come in on the emergency response?
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Chair. Aidan Dunn, Executive Director for Corporate Development, and also throughout the pandemic, I've been COVID Gold. So I've been the lead officer in terms of the strategic level response, coordinating with the other emergency services. And just In terms of lessons learned on the emergency response, although internal audit haven't been looking at it, there's been a much wider piece of work. So, for example, last week I was in a 2-hour debrief session about what have we learnt in a multi-agency setting. So we had representatives from fire, police, ambulance, health service, Coast Guard, etc., sort of reviewing how had we responded over the last 18 months. Is there any better way that we could do our coordination? What lessons can be learned? So we've looked at that at a strategic level and a tactical level as well. And indeed, the lessons that are learned are already sort of being fed into the conversations we were having on Friday in preparation of, in terms of if there is a fuel shortage, how do we coordinate that? What's our response to that? So although internal audit aren't necessarily looking at it, there is resilience in the system, and we are looking at lessons learned as we do regularly debrief after every major incident. Thank you.
Aidan, do you plan on bringing any of those lesson learnt type things to any committee within the council, so members are fully aware of the work that you guys are doing on this, and allowing members to have the assurance of what is moving forwards?
It's not a conversation we've had. I'm not sure. Could I invite Jonathan Mayer in, who's our lead officer on emergency response? And he might want to come in with a quick comment. Jonathan, if you're there.
Good morning, Chairman.
Morning, Jonathan.
Yep. So Jonathan Mayer, Corporate Director for Legal and Democratic, and my area does include emergency planning. And certainly we could bring something back to your committee if you wanted to, Chairman. I think it would be necessarily focused on this council's response to the pandemic. What Aidan has been describing is the multi-agency response and the learning from that we've been working on jointly with partners in the police and other agencies. So I think anything that we bring back to you, we could reference our work with others, but I think it would be focused upon how this council has responded.
Councillor Biggs, would you find that helpful for Jonathan to arrange something like that for us as a committee?
Yeah, I think it would be good. I just think perhaps while SWAP may not need to do a sort of detailed, drains up sort of look at it, it would be useful to have their sort of independence oversight on it, from people who hadn't been directly involved. Sometimes you may spot things that perhaps could be run better from sort of that independent view. That was all really key. But yes, I think that would be a useful process.
Chairman, if you're happy with that, I'll go outside the meeting and talk to Sally about how we do that. Of course, SWAP have been intimately involved in the council's response because SWAP colleagues were working in various of our teams, and I think Sally herself trained to be an additional registrar to register deaths if we needed others to take on that responsibility. So it really was a one-team effort at the time, but I think SWAP can bring an additional view to it.
Brilliant, Jonathan. If I leave that in your capable hands and perhaps we can get something for our next meeting, it would be helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. John Selgren, I think you want to come in on the Brexit risks.
Chairman, just want me to respond on that. So I think it has characteristics of what Aidan has said about, sorry, I should introduce myself for those joining from outside, particularly John Selgren, Executive Director for Place, and also in this capacity as members of this committee are aware, I've had the council's lead on Brexit. So my observation, Chairman, would be the Brexit issue and the management of the Brexit risks are very similar in some senses to the way in which the council's managed the COVID one. So although neither have had that explicit audit overview, I'd certainly suggest that in the case of Brexit, the way in which the council's oversight and governance of that has been overseen is actually through this committee. You quite rightly, Chairman, asked me through those early planning stages right through until the Brexit date itself and in the time beyond to bring regular reports to this committee. So I think the advice I would give you is if you feel that has discharged the council's governance role effectively, that might be a model that we use in similar situations, because both of these two are sort of civil contingencies type arrangements. Audit process can add value, but I think it's to recognise the council's got a range of tools through which it can exercise governance of these sorts of things. And for something like COVID or indeed Brexit, the committee might itself want to hold that accountability and provide that oversight and assurance. But I'll for your suggestion, Chairman. Equally well, if you'd like me to work with Sally and having a look at Brexit specifically, of course, the answer to that will be yes.
And again, over to you, Councillor Biggs. Do you think that would be quite helpful as well?
Yeah, it would. I know we've certainly had those detailed reports, and I'm just getting that feeling it's a sort of a long tail risk that some of the impacts are not, I think we almost thought, well, it's been and done. Well, actually, perhaps we're in the early stages of it, some of those staffing impacts and inflationary pressures. But yes, I think that'd be useful. Yeah.
So if I could leave that with you, John, if you could work with Sally, and again, similar to before, a piece of work that helps to provide elected members with the assurance with regards to the Brexit angle and affecting how the council works, but also the wider community as well. That would be very helpful.
Please do that, Chairman. I think likewise, as you responding or Aidan responding on the other matter, I think some lessons learned from that as well would also be helpful. I'm not expecting that we'll see something like Brexit again. It's perhaps a somewhat unique situation, but I think some of the lessons that we've learned from it will be helpful to inform other civil contingency situations. So, Chairman, that's an excellent suggestion. Happy to take it away.
Thank you, John. Next question comes from Councillor John Orell.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to respond to Councillor Biggs, also mentioned climate change, and I'm quite concerned about that one also. So if that offer of including this in future audits could be taken up, I'd be very grateful. The climate change is obviously going to hit us at some point in the future, but it seems to be happening much quicker than many people envisaged. So all the flooding and the heat waves may hit us. It may not be 50 years time, it could be next year. So we need to be prepared. There's also impacts on other aspects. I noticed later in the agenda stuff on pensions, and on page 96 the council is quite exposed on fossil fuel investments which could become stranded assets. So there's many components that we can look at with climate change. So I very much welcome that being audited. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Sally, did you want to come back on anything that's been said?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think as well as perhaps sort of talking with the senior managers around sort of any potential for sort of swap work, I think it would also be good if we could perhaps accelerate the assurance mapping process into those areas, just to identify what governance arrangements already exist within the council, and what sort of assurance mechanisms we can already rely upon before we sort of scope what work would be useful for SWAP to do. But happy to take that forward.
Thank you, Sally. I don't see any more questions coming through, so thank you, Sally, for your work. Members, that was just to note. Thank you. We move now on to agenda item number 5, which is the Deloitte draft planning report. Aidan, I'm not sure Ian House is on the call. Can you confirm whether he is, and if... Ian, I see you. I see you. Over to you, Ian. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Chair and councillors. Good to see you this morning. So we have before you our planning report for the 2021 audit. As you will recall, the 1920 audit went on longer than most of us anticipated or would have liked, but we eventually got there earlier in this year in July and got that signed off. So this planning report normally would have come to you earlier in the year, but obviously we're catching up. So we put in front of you the planning report. It came out to you in draft. The final version, I think, was issued to the committee after the papers originally went out, but there isn't really much change to that. So I'll take you through the report as shown there. If I could just move on to the executive summary, that would be a good place to start. So what this report does is go through our approach to planning the audit, and we identify as part of that process the significant risks that we see in terms of our audit process. So they won't necessarily be some of the significant risks you're worried about around climate change, etc., but these will be about the areas where we will spend most of our time in the audit and our work will be focused. We've identified those as property valuation, which is an area of lots of complex assumptions are made, an area where we did lots of work last year in the audit. So once again, we expect to spend a lot of our time making sure that the property valuation correctly reflects the requirements of the SIPFA code and the valuation approaches within that. We also identify completeness of accrued expenditure. Normally, when you do a company audit, you focus on recognition of revenue because it's about sales and about the revenue that you get in where the biggest risk lies. But in a local authority context, we tend to say that that's not so much of a risk because a lot of the money comes through grant or council tax or business rates raising. And actually, we say the easiest way for management to manipulate the accounts, something we have to assume they could possibly do. It's not something we say they're going to do or anything specific to Dorset, but we say it is a possibility that management could manipulate the accounts. And one of the ways they might do that is understate the expenditure in the year and push it into the next year so as the results look better. So again, we focus around that area, around the cut-off at the year end and making sure expenditure is recorded in the correct year. The pension fund number, you will have seen when you looked at the accounts, this big pension fund liability number and a reserve that matches it at the bottom half of the balance sheet. It is a huge number. It's very dependent on a number of assumptions that go into that, and therefore we spend quite a bit of time looking at those assumptions, making sure they're reasonable, challenging whether the approach to the pension liability valuation is appropriate. And again, that's a very key area of focus. In all audits, regardless of the sector, we have to assume that management might override controls, that they might manipulate the accounts in that way. And so we do some work on that, largely focuses around estimates, where people might be sort of overly optimistic around their estimate or overly pessimistic around the estimate. And also we look at journal controls, entries that go into the accounts through something called a journal, where adjustments are made to the account. So we check on those, make sure we think the basis for those is reasonable, that the controls over those changes are in place. You will also recall that we've qualified our value for money conclusion in the last few years around the children's services issues. The requirements around value for money have changed this year. We will be producing an auditor's annual report, which will be more narrative around what we think the arrangements in place at the council are to secure value for money. I think you'll find that much more interesting than perhaps what we've said on it in the past. Hopefully that'll be the case anyway. At the moment, the arrangements are that comes 3 months, up to 3 months after we sign the opinion on the accounts. But in order to sign the opinion on the accounts, we have to do a risk assessment to see whether we believe there are risks of this being significant weaknesses in your value for money arrangements, and we will be doing that as we go along the process. I should add that since we produced this report, one of the things we've been thinking about is whether COVID grants are a specific area of risk for us in the audit as well, and when we've concluded that, we will update you as to whether we believe that is the case. But with so many COVID grants coming out, some of which you will treat and they will be recorded as income and expenditure in your accounts because basically you've been able to decide where that money is spent. And other grants will have passed through the council and aren't shown in the accounts because really government said it must be spent here, this is what you must do, and you had no say over that. And those amounts really don't show in your accounts. They've passed through the council's sort of bank account and everything else, but they don't show up in the accounts. These two things are called whether you're acting as an agent or a principal. So where you're acting as a principal and deciding on things, you record the amounts in your accounts. Where you're acting as an agent and it's purely passed through, that doesn't get recorded. So there's quite a bit of subtle decision making around how you account for those things, and indeed how you account for whether you've fully discharged those or whether you've met all the conditions of those grants and you should record them. So I suspect as we go on with the audit, that will become an area of focus or a significant risk, and we'll come back to that. But I look forward to reporting to you our conclusions on that later in the year. I'm just going to move on to the materiality calculation, which is every year you will be familiar, we calculate a materiality level, a level above which any unadjusted misstatements would actually confuse the reader of the accounts or mislead them. We've calculated that as slightly higher than last year because expenditure has gone up a bit, and it's 14.8 million this year, so a slightly higher number. It's a big number, appreciate that from a council's perspective. You know, an error of nearly 15 million seems like a huge number, but in the context of the scale of the organisation and what it does, we believe that is a number that gives a reasonable feel that if, say, a property valuation was misstated by that much out of the nearly £1 billion of property assets, then we think that would really mislead the reader of the accounts. So that is set out on this slide that you see on screen now. It sets out the total expenditure and how our materiality fits within that. The report goes on to provide quite a bit of detail around how we're going to approach each of those significant risk areas I've described, like property valuation, pension liability. I won't take you through all the detail of that because I think that was there for you to read. We will obviously come back to that when we report to you the findings of the audit. As I said earlier on, this is obviously much later than we would normally bring a plan to you. The good news is that we've already done quite a lot of the work on the 2021 accounts, so we're well progressed with that and are moving forward with an aim to try and get that completed by the end of November or by our audit committee in November. So that has progressed much more than you might expect, given that we're presenting a plan to you today. But obviously we wanted to bring this to you so you understand the areas we're focusing on. We're working our way through that now with great cooperation, I must say, from the finance team, whose patience with us as we worked through last year's audit was much appreciated. And I think, you know, it's a good collaborative working arrangement as we work through these the challenges of an audit and all the complexities of a local government set of accounts. Chair, you will see in the report also our approach to fraud. Clearly, our primary responsibility is not around fraud. Your responsibility is to put in arrangements to prevent and detect fraud. But we do make a lot of fraud inquiries, including yourself, Chair. We'll be asking you around your awareness of fraud and the controls in place to prevent and detect fraud and corruption. And all of that builds into our approach. And obviously, we design our testing to try and identify any instances of fraud that might be present within there. And management override of control, that area of focus is a potential area for fraud. So that's where we're focusing on that as well. I think that gives you an overall summary of what we're doing. Like I said, it sets out the work that we're going to do, the key areas where we're going to be spending most of our audit time and resource. I suspect it will be updated for COVID grants, and we will then come back to you at the end and tell you that, you know, we set out in this report what we're going to do on each of those significant risk areas, and we'll tell you that we've done that or how we've had to modify our approach and what the results of that work were. I'll pause for breath there and take many questions that anybody wishes to raise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Before I put this out to members, who please do put RTS in the chat bar. Aidan, as our 151 officer, I think it would be appropriate perhaps at this point for you to give your response to the report, particularly in line with the risks that Ian's put on page 27 and 28. So could I go over to you, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ian. A very helpful report and a very clear run through there. Just sort of one point I'd like to draw out in particular around the deadline of the accounts, as Ian was very clearly saying, the statutory deadline to sign off the accounts is September. We're not going to be able to do that clearly, and we're not alone in that situation. The vast majority of county councils and unitary councils are in a similar position. So we've put on the forward plan for this committee for the November meeting, that should be in the position there to sign off the accounts. And we, as a sort of, as Ian was saying, as a finance team, are making sure that we're available as much as we can to provide all of the responses to the questions that Ian is rightly raising. So, Chair, you've asked around the key risks around pages 27 and onwards. I think it's very helpful for us to sort of understand those areas of risk. We've completed the draft accounts, and that's what Ian's looking at the moment. Things and many of these risks are sort of a part of the national situation as well. The response to COVID, the valuation of property in particular. The property market has been sort of fluctuating quite significantly, so we have to sort of choose our moment, our point of moment. And Ian's made reference as well to the pension fund valuation. We use our specialist actuary, Barnett Waddingham, to provide that advice to us, and we've incorporated the figures accordingly. And Ian is rightly saying that he'll be testing and challenging that, as is the need and the importance of his role. So generally, that's I'm sort of content with the report. It's very helpful and gives us a good clear steer of the areas that the audit team will be exploring. Is there any area in particular, Chairman, that you'd like me to comment on?
One thing that springs to mind is that with regard to risk 2, where it talks about invoices not being put through on time to potentially benefit the year-end figures, but then of course anything that's done like that affects the Q1 figures for the following year. Yes, that is a risk, but what is the reality of that risk? Does that happen? Does that happen to any great deal? What is your feeling? How justified is this risk?
I think it is a risk, clearly, as the auditor has said. It's not something that we do deliberately to manipulate the year-end position, and it's not the right thing to do, the professional thing to do. I think there's a risk of sort of perhaps last-minute transactional processing that might miss a date, something along those lines. But that's where the materiality that Ian was talking about comes in. So I don't see it as a risk. So from my perspective, I'm confident that this shouldn't be a big issue for us, but it's Ian's job to assure himself and you as an audit committee that that is indeed the case.
Thanks, Aidan. And the other one that springs to mind is obviously the valuation of assets. Obviously, a lot has been said over this last year about that, and about perhaps, there's work that needs to be done. Do you feel confident that in the coming financial year that won't be quite such an issue that is prevalent on the accounts?
Thanks. Yes, I do feel confident. There's the issue really as a new authority that we are continuing, relatively new authority, continuing to understand our estate more and more. And in particular, we, from a finance perspective, have been in conversation with the colleagues in place about having some more specialist and dedicated support in the property and assets team, so that we can sort of just have an absolute focus on this area. I think perhaps John Selgren might want to comment on that. If we want to talk about specific areas, then I'd welcome my colleague Heather Lappin to have a quick conversation, because I'm conscious that she has daily conversations with the property team about this and might want to be able to give you a bit more assurance.
Okay, if I go to John Selgren first.
Thank you, Chairman. John Selgren, Executive Director for Place Assets and Property Function, sits within the Place Director, as Aidan has indicated. So I can confirm that we have agreed to add an additional post to the structure to make sure that valuation of assets is robust as it needs to be, and indeed support and work closely with the external and indeed internal auditor on that matter. So members will know that we've recently been through a large restructure in the property and assets team, and this then is something that will come additional to that to make sure this function is carried out robustly.
Thank you, John. Heather, are you there, and do you wish to add anything?
Hello, everybody. I'm Heather Lappin, the Head of Strategic Finance. Yes, I would just like to add that we are currently going out to tender to evaluate all our assets for the 21-22 accounts. So we should have a really good understanding of what all our assets are and the values for those as part of those accounts. Thank you. Thanks, Heather.
Ian, I think you wanted to come back.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. A couple of things there. Property valuation comes up in virtually all of our audits, and most of the issues that come out of our audits are related to property valuation because of the complexity, because of the sheer range of assets that a local authority uses in the delivery of its services. So I wouldn't say there's anything unusual. I think the issues that we encountered last year were largely due to the merger and the complexity of bringing together all of the records and the various valuation methods in relation to that. So I would just give that context to members in terms of the fact that that's there, and as I say, it's probably the area that most audits have the most issues in because of the complexity and scale that we're dealing with. I'd also like to pick up briefly, if I may, Chair, before others come in, on the point that Aidan made around timeline. Clearly, the audit profession is not happy with the situation where so many audits are not getting done by the deadline that government would like them done by. It is a huge issue across the sector in terms of both resource and some of the complexities that have arisen as a result of doing audits remotely due to COVID. But the main issue is actually a scarcity of people with the knowledge and skills of local authority accounting in order to do this work. You will not be on your own by any stretch of the imagination in terms of those not signed by the end of September. Indeed, I think most audit firms consider the end of November a more realistic deadline for most of the work that they're doing, and some will go on well beyond that. There are still some 18, 19 and 19, 20 local authority audits not completed yet. So it's a sector-wide issue. I don't think you're actually any particularly worse off than many others. So I think it's important for members to understand that, and to understand that your team are working very hard to enable us to do it as quickly as we can with the resources available to us as a firm as well. So I think it's not ideal, and the situation is through the Redmond review. MHCLG are constantly trying to work out what they can do to support the sector, and there are ongoing discussions around how they can make it easier for perhaps corporate auditors to gain the necessary qualifications to assist in this very important market, and how we assure the public that their money is being appropriately spent and protected. So it is a major issue for government as well as for the audit firms and those providing the supply, and we all wish to see a resolution that gets us all back onto a more reasonable timeline.
Thanks, Ian. That's quite reassuring in many respects, but you've hit on a question which I was going to ask you, which is the timeline has obviously shifted over this last year because of all the issues which you've mentioned. Do you foresee this coming year being better for keeping to the timeline, or would you expect it to still cause issues as we move forward? Because I'm quite interested in your answer on this, because of course I spend quite a lot of time trying to work out when the accounts are coming through, etc. And I need the assurance about whether we think we will be on time, or whether we will still be talking about things as we are at this time next year.
It's a very difficult question in many ways. I think this year it is easier for us because we don't have the complexities of the merger and the accounting for both aggregation and disaggregation, which did cause us some difficulty, and is something that we weren't used to doing. So we had to learn our way through that as well. But it's not just unique to the council's challenges, or that they were challenges for us as auditors as well. We're definitely bringing the timeline. I see it getting earlier in the process as we move forward. Whether September is ever realistic when effectively the authority completes a set of accounts by the end of July, then their staff quite rightly need a break in August. My staff have been working throughout the year as well and are looking for a break in August, which means August is not the most productive month, which then means to get papers out for a September committee, we've got very little window in which to do the work. And I think, the audit firms have said very clearly to government, this is not a very realistic timeline. But clearly all the authorities want their accounts signed and out of the way. So the authorities were saying, well, we'd love it all done by the end of September. So there is a bit of tension there. Clearly everybody is committed to trying to make it a smoother, better process with shorter timelines. And our aim is to make it earlier each year as we move forward. We're obviously trying to make up for quite a very late process from last year. As I say, not as late as some, but I think for us we felt it was very late, and I'm sure the council did as well. So I can't offer you guarantees, I'm afraid, Chair. It is and sometimes issues will arise that do take time to resolve. If we find something quite complex, they can take time to resolve. So it's quite difficult to say, but our aim is very much to bring it back in line with the national timelines as much as we can, and to be earlier in the process, because you have other business to get on with as well. We appreciate that. So we appreciate your patience, and we will try and keep you as updated as possible as these things improve when we go forward.
Thank you, Ian, much appreciated. Councillor Mike Parks, you have a question.
Thank you, Chairman. I think it's actually been answered because it was actually relating to timelines, and Ian's first response sort of half covered it, and then you actually stole the rest of the question that I had, Chairman. But I would just like to kind of add my concerns, the fact that, from those responses we've just received, we are looking at, potentially missing deadlines again, and that becomes a real risk in perception of how this council is viewed from the public point of view. So I think we just need to be, really holding people's feet to the fire to make sure we achieve these timelines as best we can.
Thanks, Mike. Aidan, did you want to make any comments with regards to the timeline, etc.?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think I'd echo Ian's comment, first of all, that we want the accounts done properly, but we want them done quickly so that we can concentrate on this year's rather than sort of being dragged to look back at last year. So I think it's in everybody's interest to get them done quickly. But it's interesting, isn't it, that this is a common theme for the nation at the moment. We don't appear to have the right skills for the roles that we're expecting at the moment. And as much as this appears to be an issue for HGV drivers, it is similarly there's an audit skills issue here. So I think there's a degree of frustration and sympathy at the same time. I sort of recommend that we as the council team will do everything we can to work alongside Ian so that he's got all the information he needs so that we can hit that November ambition that we have.
Thank you, Aidan. Next question from Councillor Biggs.
Thank you, Chair. The risk around property valuations is an old chestnut that comes around almost every year. And I think there's almost a sort of slight feeling or slight groan from some officers and councillors in that, what is the relevance of that? But I actually, I've reflected on this, and I actually think it is probably more important than we think about, because our assets, our buildings and land are our strategic assets, and actually they have great importance, what we do with those and how efficient we are with them, which is, I know, is a slightly different thing from the actual valuation. So I'm reassured, I think, that the council seem to be putting in measures to address the valuations with that additional capacity. I suppose the wider thing that it's opening up for me really is, what are these assets in terms of which ones are operational, which ones are non-operational, what that percentage, and are we using those assets efficiently? So in order to make that calculation and that knowledge, we do need accurate valuations. So we do need that information. And I think it's something that the National Audit Office recently put out a report into managing council property assets. So I actually think it is, it is right that it is up there as one of the top risks, and perhaps we underplay that a little bit, because we do need to know, and we are in the process of selling or disposing one of our key assets, which is Southwark's House. So we do deal with big values, and they are big sums of money, which the public are concerned about how we deal with them. And I think we perhaps get a little bit blasé about, oh well, it's not the revenue, so it's. So I just wonder whether that's something, maybe it's a question for perhaps Heather Lappin or John Selgren, really, as to, are we getting more information about that property assets? Is that something that would come to audit, or is that a scrutiny matter? Thank you.
John or Heather, did you want to come back on that for Richard?
Chairman, if I might, it's John Selgren. I think it is a point well made. I think it is important members do have oversight of those things. Point is well made by councillors around this particular table. The scale, the amount of money that's involved in property transactions. So I think it is important that there is an audit take on that, particularly to make sure that we do secure value for money. Indeed, the statutory obligations around all of that. But likewise, I think members of the Scrutiny Committee also recognise that they will have a part to play in this. I think perhaps focusing on that wider perspective. And again, this is featured in the conversations that we've had in relation to the Place and Resources Scrutiny Committee, where the chairman of that committee and his members have looked at Southwark's, for example, and would like Southwark's House, and would like to do a review of that post-event to take the learning out. Because as we know, when the council buys, or indeed in this case sells assets, it's important that we achieve the value for money financial consideration. But as members are only too well aware, and your property and asset management strategy reflects this, that the council is mindful of the wider implications which its property activities have, particularly in local economies, particularly but not exclusively in town centres. So I think certainly, Chairman, a role for the Audit Committee around the monetary side of it, and potentially a role of additionality around the Scrutiny Committee that's perhaps looking at the wider impacts on properties, the council's property assets, and the added value that they give within communities beyond merely the financial consideration.
Did you want to come back on anything there, Richard?
No, I think that is John's answered that very well. Thank you.
Ian, you wish to come back on Councillor Biggs's question?
Well, just to thank him for raising the point, because we as auditors do spend a lot of time looking at property valuations, and particularly the very relevant point, which was the classification between investment properties, surplus properties, and those that are operational, because I think that is really important to understand which ones are surplus and which ones are for sale, etc. So we do spend time, and I can reassure Councillor that that's one of the key focuses, that classification. I also understand the argument that many put forward, which is this has no impact on council taxpayers directly in terms of the valuation, because the entries go in and back out of the primary statements, because what is reflected in there is the minimum revenue provision rather than things like depreciation, etc. And that the asset valuations are a bit unusual in that they're these modern equivalent asset valuations, but it is a very important part of the accounts, gives an important picture of the assets being consumed by the council in the delivery of the services. So we do spend a lot of time focusing on it, and obviously it's there for comparability as well. And one of the key things we're testing there is the application of the rules, so as your valuation is comparable with other authorities and allows the reader to look across, particularly where they may live on boundaries between two councils, and they're able to look at neighbouring councils and see what's happening. So it is an important part of our work. I really appreciate members understanding that. And you know, I can reassure you that the focus is around those classifications as well, in terms of surplus and investment assets as well as operation.
Thank you, Ian. Members, I don't see any other questions coming through, so we have received the report from Ian House. Thank you, Ian, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon. Thank you. Members, if we now move on to agenda item 6, which is the risk management update, over to David Trotter, I believe.
Yes, morning everyone. My name is David Trotter. I'm the Risk and Resilience Officer. So what I'm going to do, I will introduce the reports, and then I will be handing over to Mr. Selgren, the Executive Director for Place, who will then talk about a workshop we recently held that's following a request at the last meeting. And then I imagine I will need to come back because I've had a question from Councillor Cocking. I'm sure Councillor Cocking will introduce that and I will respond. But firstly, thank you for the opportunity. The reports in front of you today see a shift from the 3x3 matrix to a 5x5 matrix, and this has been developed with a joint positive discussions with the Chairman and Vice Chairman of this committee. Subsequently, we've revised the risk appetite statement, the risk strategy, and all of the risk registers which are held on SharePoint, Microsoft SharePoint here, have been reflected to recognise the revised scoring. So in front of you today, you've got 2 reports. You've got a snapshot of performance, which shows a breakdown of the 5x5 matrices by the directorates, which are also hyperlinked to the risk registers. And you've got the exception report, which is quite meaty, but in fact about 30 odd pages, which shows extreme and high level risks. Feedback from members asked for fuller details, which I'm pleased to report we have now got. These are being reviewed and updated on a regular basis, which includes date review, direction of travel, and we're also we've got greater text around controls and mitigating actions. Within the SharePoint site, as soon as the papers are released to members, the SharePoint site is updated, and these include all the reports. And also we've introduced a training section, which is also being developed for members and officers. So that's quite useful. As you see, since the report's been published, there has been further amendments. We currently have a total of 254 risks, 3 of which are still extreme, 1%, and 49 high level, which represents 19%. And the 3 extreme risks, we got 1 in adult housing, market failure leads to unsafe and unacceptable levels of unmet need for domiciliary care, and 2 in corporate development services around ICT, which is loss of service through cyber attack, and a business continuity risk delayed through ICT recovery in case of disruption of service, something like a power failure. So we've met with both Mark and I, the insurance manager, we've met with teams, individual officers, and we're holding workshops. So we've recently held a workshop with the Place Service, and I'm going to hand over to Mr. Selgren now, who's going to discuss that workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So it's one of 2 cameo inputs I'm giving to the committee this morning on this topic and later on. So firstly, you did quite rightly as a committee note that the Place Directorate risks hadn't been reviewed in a while and asked that to be done. So I can confirm that was done, as David said. We had a workshop back in July. I think, Chairman, there's some slides that accompany this, so I can either talk to them, but if whoever's presenting could put them up, then that would be helpful, but not absolutely essential. So we held the workshop in July, and we reviewed all of the risks, and particularly focusing on those high-level extreme risks that are referred to in the report. And in terms of the mitigations, being clear about the assurance process. Thank you, presenter. Next one. Oops, disappeared. Just pause briefly so I can get the projection up so it doesn't distract us. I think, Chairman, we're just struggling a little bit with the technology. I'll keep talking if I may. So we held the workshop in July, I said, and looked at the high and extreme risks. We also, as always, look at the mitigations for those, and particularly to ensure we've got that clarity of what the assurance and mitigations are, who is going to take those actions, and the timescale by which they will be implemented and managed. And then we kind of look back at those having done the risk, and this was quite a powerful part of the process. Actually, it's very easy to go through a matrix and do your assessment, and I've had this on numerous occasions before when reviewing risk matrices, both in this and indeed previous councils. To when you've done it, to look back and sort of sense check it. When you look at those risks again, you reviewed them. Does that sort of pass the sense test? And do these risks broadly look to be consistent, recognising they come from a range of areas of the business? And that just helps identify any remaining gaps. And I can confirm, Chairman, that we did that, and I'll come on in the presentation in a moment and do just that. So as we haven't got a presentation, Chair, I'm just going to try and talk to these, just talk you through the high-level risks that we looked at. I'm just praying that it just might come up, because it would be so much easier if you can see this on screen as I can. Just keep persevering. I think if I was presenting, just looking good. Next one, please. There we go. One more. Perfect. Thank you. Now we've got it, Chairman, so members can see that as well. So these are the existing high-level risks that we looked at. I'll deal with them. They're categorised very helpfully on the side. So we begin with those which are a breach of statutory duty. So I suspect I don't need to tell any members on this call the significance of the 5-year housing land supply driving a lot of the decision-making process in planning. And indeed, as members will not need a reminder, government policy position has been that if councils are not able to meet that 5-year housing land supply test, then they remain open to speculative development. And certainly in the creation of Dorset Council and your very early priority to commission a new local plan for Dorset Council, it is this risk that you were seeking to address as part of that process. So we have that on the risk register. Similarly, the implications of the Traffic Commissioner breach of statutory duty in relation to the council's operation of its transport fleet. The powers of the Traffic Commissioner are quite significant in allowing the Commissioner to revoke licences of operators who can't operate their vehicles safely. And of course, that's in the wider interest of everybody on the roads. And we know exactly why that is so important. So we put very high focus on that, because the council does operate a large number of vehicles which require an operator's licence, and we take that matter extremely seriously. In relation to the finance pressures, clearly the Place Directorate has a large and complex budget, but the two which particularly stand out as being quite volatile, particularly in relation to the winter service. This is largely winter highways treatment. So members will be aware that due to variations in climatic condition year to year, we may or may not do fewer or more salt runs in particular. Other things that of course go along with that, because as members know, winter pressures can often break up the highway to a greater degree, requiring more maintenance. But particularly, this is quite a high and volatile budget. So for that reason, this is one that is on our risk register. The other one is in relation to future funding, and again referring back, Chairman, probably to Brexit. Clearly, the European funding regime has run its course, and we now look to government to bring forward proposals around future funding for investment, particularly in relation to economic development and regeneration. And members will know specifically that this council has made an application under the recently announced levelling up funding, and we wait announcement for that in the autumn. But nonetheless, the government as yet is still to set out with in detail the proposals for the things that will replace the former European funding arrangements, and indeed some of the domestic regeneration funding programmes as well. Clearly, with the new Secretary of State appointed with his title and his remit from the Prime Minister, and indeed now in the local government sponsoring department's title, it is clear that government has got a clear focus on levelling up, and therefore when we come to review this risk, that may change in the light of emerging government policy. Climate's the next one down. Again, a significant risk for Dorset as a coastal place, in particular in areas such as Weymouth. Again, not exclusively to Weymouth, but in terms of potential for property loss, which is what government will measure in these circumstances. So again, reminding us about the importance of investment and maintenance of sea defences in a coastal county like Dorset. Our evidence base, critical in relation to planning. I don't think members on this call will need reminding, and again, news in recent days about the white paper that the government launched some time ago. Clearly, with a new Secretary of State appointed, government's indicated its intentions to revisit its proposals in relation to a future national planning policy. But of course, with the council in the process of making a new plan, we can only make that plan in the light of policy which government has already announced and enacted. Therefore, if there's uncertainty, which there is, whilst the government has indicated it has intentions for future reform, but as yet has not confirmed in legislation or secondary legislation what those things are, then clearly that does remain a risk for the council, because we could be moving forward with a local plan that, were the government to pass within the relevant timescale significant policy changes, that could have an impact on our ability to make that plan within the timescales that members have asked us to do. The Directorate carries significant safeguarding risks. It's not only the people, the Children's and the Adults Directorates that carry responsibilities in relation to safeguarding. The particular focus of risk for the Place Directorate is around transportation, particularly of adults in this context. There are risks in relation to children, but it's the adult safeguarding, the particular focus that comes through the risk register. I'd have the next slide, please. There are legislative changes on the horizon in relation to school transport, which relates to effectively the sharing of particular transport routes between paying passengers and those who are transported by the council as part of the home-to-school transport arrangements. So again, we're cited on that, and an emerging legislative change which could have both a service delivery and a financial impact of some scale for the council. Transformation, members will be aware that the transformation programme is a very high profile and very wide-ranging process for the council and for the Place Director, and indeed for others. One of the implications of that is that there are staff restructures, and I spoke a moment ago under the other item about the restructure we just completed in the Assets and Property Service. And whilst I'm pleased to say that the restructures we've been able to retain suitably qualified and experienced staff, there remains a risk, and a significant risk, that processes of change can cause uncertainty and turbulence in our staffing arrangements, and that is a risk, because if we don't have the appropriately qualified people to deliver the services, then clearly that does leave us exposed. So we're very mindful and very cautious about the approach we take to restructuring, to ensure that we do not lose experienced and knowledgeable staff as a result of that. Challenges come next to a group around health and safety. I will always say when I address staff on these matters, health and safety is absolutely at the top and the forefront of the Directorate's agenda and priorities. And in this context, there are three that come out specifically. Firstly, there's the what known as effectively the pure regulations. These relate to the use of equipment. So the bigger risks for Place, I mean, they exist across every single piece of equipment that we use, and indeed that's what the regulations refer to. But obviously we have staff who operate quite heavy or dangerous plant and equipment, and therefore this makes sure that we keep a very, very clear focus on the effective management of those pieces of tools and that equipment to ensure that staff are not put at any greater risk than that which we can mitigate. The duty holder in the next one principally relates to the council as operator of premises. That's those we were saying a moment ago, not only for its own use, but potentially that it gives others the facility to use. And there are significant health and safety implications that come with that, particularly around testing facilities, electrical testing, water testing, and so on. And therefore, that remains a very high profile risk that the Directorate focuses on with considerable diligence. And then there are others around health and safety. As I said, much of the, there are significant areas of risk in relation to health and safety incidents and accidents. And it's for that reason we seek to have a very robust arrangement supported by our colleagues in corporate human resources to make sure that we have good and effective accident reporting, and also, Chairman, importantly, near miss reporting as well, because it's the near misses where something mercifully doesn't happen but might have done that gives us very good insight into the areas where we need to tighten up our safeguards. And it's for that reason, and indeed I make absolutely no apology for it, that health and safety risk remains a very, very high profile focus in our assessments. Some specifics now in relation to infrastructure. So members that know the patch will, I think all on this call will be aware of it. Wareham Crossing and the arrangements there remains, in a sense, a temporary solution to a problem. We continue discussions with government about a longer term sustainable future for Wareham Crossing, but nonetheless, that remains a significant infrastructure risk point. Similarly, on waste, it is the case that waste is a very highly regulated function, and the council is just has the same level of compliance needed in relation to the operation of waste facilities as does anybody in that industry. And one of the challenges, of course, is to make sure that we can find appropriate future locations to put waste infrastructure. And members will be aware that in the waste service, we currently have a number of projects that are being progressed in relation to renewing or re-providing for our waste services. Because waste is so highly regulated and licensed, there are significant hurdles that we as a council need to pass adequately through to satisfy the various regulatory bodies, but also, of course, the planning process itself to make sure that waste facilities are located in the appropriate places and that the appropriate environmental safeguards are in place. The next one, Chairman, relates to the capital programme and also for external funding. And again, pertinent in relation to the conversation we just had in connection with the audit, but making sure that our properties are well maintained and suitably and safely operated, again, is a high risk profile for the Directorate and one we keep a very close eye on. And the final one is in relation to the maintenance of the highway. This council has a very good reputation nationally, and that's been externally referenced and accredited for the standard of our highway. It is, of course, that which means that people can travel safely through the county on our roads, and therefore making sure that that is adequately resourced, or as in this case, if it weren't to be adequately resourced, that would clearly be a significant risk for the department. So, Chairman, in summary, in conclusion, I just said that the process does provide the opportunity to look at additional risks that we need to add to the register. And if I can have the next slide, it just summarises those. So the first is to recognise the importance of committee processes, of the member-making process. And I think, Chairman, you and committee members will see that a lot of the things that I have referred to are underpinned by significant member decisions, particularly, but not again exclusively, in relation to financial matters. And therefore, the timeliness of those decisions, particularly to implement projects which have long lead times, such as the re-provision of a household recycling centre, for example, it's important that members make those decisions in a timely manner so that those projects and that re-provision can go forward. The second one, Chairman, is probably a little bit of code there, and I do apologise to members when I looked at this the other day. I thought, gosh, could we perhaps put that in rather plainer English? This one specifically relates to an incident that occurred where, as a result of a tree falling in the highway, there was a risk that there was an incident that was reported and investigated by the Health and Safety Inspectorate. And as a result of that, specific action I took was to add to the establishment an additional post to ensure that we had more regular inspection of trees, which could be by disease or by having their roots constrained or whatever, be at risk of falling or having branches fall from them, which posed a risk to members of the public. And Chairman, in that context, it's not just the highway where the council has a significant ownership of trees which need to be inspected regularly. We also, of course, have those in our parks and public open spaces. So again, having a systematic and thorough system to inspect trees to ensure that the risk of where it can be assessed that there is a risk of a branch failure or complete tree failure, and that's dealt with, is an important part of what we do. And again, Chairman, a good illustration, I think, of where lessons learned from an HSE referral have resulted in the council taking specific action and indeed for us maintaining that risk on our risk register. I referred earlier, Chairman, to the other one, this matter of the recruiting and retention of critical posts. And again, in the other item into which I'm making an input this morning, I would perhaps speak a little bit more about that matter. But as I've said, the Directorate's safe operation does require us having appropriately qualified and experienced staff to deliver our services. And the final one, Chairman, is to recognise that I know it's particularly the case in people services, but also fair to say that in relation to COVID, that has produced additional demand upon our services, which we believe may carry on. And if I give you a simple one, we've certainly noticed, as other councils have, a trend that there has been some reduction in trade waste, particularly a result of people not working from offices, and that material finding its way into the domestic waste stream. So again, there's a direct financial impact on that. So it's just to make sure that we're sighted on the fact that even though the virus may be beginning to become under control and less of an immediate risk, nonetheless, there are still implications for councils and for the Police Directorate of the ongoing consequences of COVID, and indeed the need to maintain a slightly more virus reduction, transmission reduction environment. Chairman, I think that ends the comments. I do hope that you and members found that helpful and perhaps bringing to life a bit about the particular work in the Directorate, but also more generally illustrating how we review the risk register within Directorates. And I think, David, just to remind you, David Trotter's comment at the end there, that the process that we've gone through in place, I think, has proved to be helpful, and we are, corporate risk are recommending that other Directorates will hold similar workshops in the months that lie ahead. Chairman, I hope that was helpful, and that ends what I have to present.
Thank you, John. Very helpful. Before I open up to questions from members, I don't know whether this is a question for Jonathan Mayer or for David Trotter, but can we just confirm that the Audit Committee's role in this is to make sure that the processes are in place and that we have assurance that the processes are in place? The actual risks themselves, if they need going into, that is to be done either by the overview or the scrutiny committees. Can somebody please confirm that? And do we need to go through everything line by line, or is this an automatic process that the relevant risk will go to health or go to people and resources, please?
Chairman, I can confirm your understanding is correct. Jonathan Mayer, Corporate Director for Legal and Democratic. Yes, you're looking at the processes and the systems that are in place to ensure that the correct environment is there to manage risks properly. The individual risks will be looked at within the relevant scrutiny committee.
So, Jonathan, just to be 100% clear, will these risks, will David be doing a presentation to people and health? We don't need to go line by line saying we want risk A going to, risk B going to. We don't need to do that.
I don't think you need to, Chairman, but I'm going to look to David to make sure that I've got that right.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, we'll be carrying out workshops of other services, and as you said, you are correct. That's the approach we're going to take.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. First question, which I believe, David, you are aware of, comes from Councillor Susan Cocking.
Thank you, David. First of all, obviously I sent you an email, and thank you for the report. It's really clear and concise, and it's really easy to understand. My question was, how are we exposed to risk compared to other councils? When I looked at the report, it was 248, and now you're saying it's 254, 3 extreme, 49 high. And I just wanted to know, I don't want to add any more work to the officers, but I just wanted to know, how are we higher? We've got much more risk than other councils. Are we more exposed? How do we compare to other councils on these risks?
Okay, well, thank you, Councillor. The question has come about because when we sent the committee papers, we also sent a questionnaire asking members to submit any questions to us so we can make sure that we get the relevant officers here to answer your queries. So Councillor Cockings asked me to possibly, well, I will do, benchmark against our family group. When I say family group, it's councils which are very similar to our size, population, etc. So that's an exercise I will undertake. So I'll see what the current figures are regards to number of risks, extreme, high, etc. And I will carry out a benchmarking exercise and I will bring the findings back to the committee or circulate it through the members' bulletin to members.
Thank you, David. Susan, did you want to come back on anything?
No, thank you. That's great. I don't want to cause any more extra work because I know the officers are under extreme pressure, but it was just to give us a benchmark against similar councils with similar sizes of the population. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Susan.
Your report.
Next question from Councillor John Orell.
Thank you, Chair. I will modify my question in view of that clarification you gave about not being too detailed in this committee. But just to say thank you for the report. It's very clearly set out, and I compliment you on that. It's very easy to read and then to drill down to the detail in the boxes. Obviously, I was drawn to 201 because this one particularly would wipe out my ward if we work. If we have to relocate coastal communities, that's the end of my ward. So obviously that's too detailed for this committee, but thank you for flagging it up as high risk, because it is. I think it's a 5, but thank you for highlighting it.
Thank you, John. And I'm glad you find this easy to work. I know read and work through, because I know David and Mark Era spent a lot of time trying to make this as user-friendly as possible. I don't know, David, if you wanted to come back on anything, or John, whether you wanted to pick up this particular issue that Councillor Orell was talking about outside of this meeting.
Happy to do that, Chairman. I think that, as we were indicating earlier, will get picked up in the relevant scrutiny committee, but equally well happy to speak to Councillor Orell outside this meeting on that point. Thank you.
Thank you. David Trotter, you got a comment? Yeah.
Yes, please. I need to point out to members that there's going to be, in the covering report, we had a roadmap showing you what we hope to do prior to the next financial year. So we will look to introduce residual risk, which is a score after the mitigation and controls being put in place. So currently we're reporting on the inherent risks, which is before mitigation and controls, which we are getting fuller details I reported. But another piece of work to notice that currently we're reporting against 21 strategic themes in the risk registers, and we're going to look to make that more succinct and perhaps a bit better Dorset Council focus. So hopefully bring it down to say perhaps 10 or 11 or something like that. But that's work which is ongoing, which I need to bring to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Councillor Biggs, you're next.
Thank you. Yes, I think the level of risk management is becoming very mature now, and it's very pleasing that I think we've travelled an awful long way, and that's thanks to an awful lot of work, and Ms. Trotter particularly. One of the asks from this committee was obviously for place. It was felt that there was a definite failing, or not failing, but work hadn't perhaps been done there, and that clearly has been done. I've been very impressed with the detail, to the point now where I think places it's got 152 risks and children 24, so it's highlighting, which is good. It's almost a bit of healthy competition, but at the end of the day, I suppose it's not about a numbers game, and actually doing a benchmark with other won't really tell us, having the number of risks, where you've got more than us, doesn't really, is how you manage those risks and are they appropriate. I think one of the useful functions, if you delve into those risks, is that area where the mitigations are reviewed. I don't know if it's David who does that, but there's a sort of thumbs up or green or a red. And generally they are really well thought through and placed. Although I did just pick out one, and I think that was ID 332, which is about the increase in labour costs, etc. And there was a message there, clearly because it hadn't been reviewed since May, and I think that's one of the exceptions, because most of them are very recent. But obviously with that inflation thing, as we've been talking about, it's probably one that you need to be really have a close a regular review on. And I guess you probably, it's likely that many of the team think, well, we can't do anything about that anyway. We just got to pay whatever, you know. Well, I suppose there is, if you really thought about it, it means you're perhaps not doing things because you can't afford it. You know, that pot of money is shrinking because it's being eaten by those costs. So there's almost a fallback rather than you can't stop them putting their prices up, but you may have to do less work or change the way you operate or look for other suppliers. So probably is things that you could put in there in detail really. That's just a sort of overriding thought. And the only other thing that if I was looking for that perfection, which I always be involved in risk management, I see everything is modelled on where we are now rather than where there's no target value when you detail that I could see, you know, where do we expect to be when we've done all our mitigation. We have the direction of travel, but we're saying, you know, what are we comfortable with getting to? Because obviously it is, you know, you're never going to eliminate many of these risks, but you're going to get to a level that you're comfortable with. And I'm not clear from looking at ours, but where we just focus on where we are now and where we were last reporting period, we can't see that. So that to me would be the next step, to have that other bit of granularity. But I know it's a lot of work, and we're moving on a journey. But no, good work so far. Thank you.
Did you want to come back on anything there, David, or even John, as some of those comments were with regards to your directorate specifically?
Chairman, John Selgren, can I just comment on the wage rate issue, which is because very pertinent at the moment in the context of drivers, members are too well aware. So one of the ways that we do that is make sure that we keep closely aligned with surrounding councils. Clearly, you know, it's for each council to set the level of remuneration it thinks appropriate through its following its own policies and so on. But nonetheless, we do try and be careful that we don't effectively create a labour market in which we sort of have a bid up war with it between neighbouring councils if we can avoid that. So that's part of the mitigation of that. The other one, of course, and again, we may say a little bit more about this in the item we'll come on talk about, again, where I've been asked just to use place as an example, to make sure that we're developing our own workforce, but also being very careful in the use of agency and casual staff, just again to make sure that we are not, in a sense, fueling a labour market bid up war.
Did you want to come back on anything, David, or are you all okay with what's been said?
No, I'm fine, thank you, Chairman. I've taken on board your comments, and as you know, anything which I've looked to develop, I will share with both you and the Vice Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Don't see any more questions coming through from members, so thank you all very much. Thank you, David, for all your work. That agenda item was to note and review. Thank you. Agenda item 7 we move on to, which is the Treasury Management Annual Report, and I believe this is over to David Wilkes, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to introduce myself, I'm David Wilkes. I'm the Service Manager for Treasury and Investments. I don't plan to go through the report in infinite detail, but I'll highlight a few key points and do my best to answer any questions that you may have. So the Council follows the SIPFA Treasury Management Code of Practice, which means that we need, as a minimum, to produce an annual Treasury Management strategy and then a mid-year update and an annual review of activity, which is this report. Just for information, we'll also be bringing the mid-year update for the current financial year to your next meeting in November. So it'll be no surprise to anyone that the dominating factor on Treasury management activity, as it was on perhaps all council activity last year, was COVID-19. So it had a big impact operationally on how we work. Me and my team had to move very quickly from an office-based paper-dependent processes to working remotely in late March 2020. And the team have continued to work full-time from home for the whole year. And I've been very, very pleased with how well I think we've adapted to that change and managed to continue doing the work that we need to do. It was, as I'm sure was common with others, it was very unsettling at first, but I think we've adapted well. We also took the opportunity to train up some colleagues from the wider Finance and Commercial Directorate to provide a bit more resilience in case of sickness within the team. So that's worked well as well for us operationally. COVID's also had a huge impact on the cash flows that we had to manage throughout the year. So in some cases, there's more operational expenditure as part of the council's response through the year, and also some dips in some of our income streams. We've also seen that it's had an impact on the capital programme, so less spending on the capital programme than was expected through the year. But probably the biggest impact in terms of cash flows has been the receipt and the administration of funding that we've received from central government through the year. So I'm sure Aidan or Jim will correct me if I've got my figures wrong here, but during 2020-2021, the council received central government funding of over £300 million. Now that was largely to support small and medium-sized businesses within the Dorset Council area through the various grant schemes. So some funding for council's services directly, but overwhelmingly from that sum of money was effectively the council acting as the conduit to get the central government funding out to businesses locally. So for us in the Treasury and investments team, we've obviously had to invest that money securely and accessibly on receipt from government, and sometimes that was at very, if no notice at all, receiving that money. And we've had to then keep that safe and in liquid prior to the payment of grants to the businesses, which were administered by colleagues in the Revenues and Benefits Service and accounts payable and IT colleagues as well had to work extremely hard to ensure that those grants got out to the businesses that needed them when they needed them. COVID's also had an impact on the wider economy and financial markets background that we operate in terms of Treasury management. So the report refers to this as external context, and there's a brief summary in the report of the key factors, but there's also a very detailed description in the appendix, which has been provided by the Council's Treasury Management Advisors, Arlene Close. So full chapter and verse in terms of the operational kind of context in which we were operating during the year. We also saw that financial markets recovered very sharply from the falls that we saw in March and April of 2020. So you may recall this time last year me talking about a fall in the fair value of the assets, the so-called strategic investments that we held of approximately £8.5 million. And we've seen this financial year that has reversed. So we've seen increases of approaching £9.5 million in terms of the value of those investments that we held through the course of the year. So moving on directly from COVID, in the executive summary, I picked out a few key metrics for the year, which I'll just highlight again here. So the capital financing requirement, which is effectively the underlying borrowing need of the council, at the end of the financial year was £335 million, which was an increase from 320 at the start of the year, but it was actually below what we estimated it would be when the strategy was approved by full council in February 2020. And the reason why the external borrowing requirement hasn't increased as much as we expected was due to slippage in the capital programme, which I alluded to earlier. In terms of the actual borrowing that we have outstanding, or we had outstanding at the end of March, we were up at £245 million, and the cost effectively of servicing that amount of debt was £7.7 million for the year. And the difference between the capital financing requirement and the actual borrowing was about 90 million, approximately 90 million. And that was financed temporarily by what's referred to as internal borrowing. So basically this is using reserves and working capital that the council holds and could otherwise have been invested. Rather than investing that money's been used to effectively offset the need to borrow money. Also, in terms of the cash and cash equivalents at the end of the year, we had cash and cash equivalents of approximately £84 million, and then we had in what so-called treasury investments of £85 million at the end of the year, so just shy of £170 million in terms of cash equivalents and treasury investments. And those investments and cash holdings generated approximately £3.5 million across the course of the year. Thank you, Chairman. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, David. Members, if you've got any questions, please put RTS in the chat bar. David, perhaps a slightly delicate question. 14.2 on the report with regards to the monies for small and medium businesses that the council then passes on. It says monies received were temporarily invested in short-dated liquid instruments such as call accounts, money market funds, etc. Do I presume that the council was not allowed to put that money in anything that would gain it a return?
No, there were no restrictions, certainly to the best of my knowledge, in terms of the government placed on that money coming to us. There was a very clear expectation from government, rightly so, that money got out into the wider business community as quickly as it could be done, but that was obviously subject to the administration of that service, of that grant, making sure that checks were done in terms of banking details, in terms of those businesses that sought the money. So there's no restriction in terms of from the government in terms of what we did with that money. The reality is that because the money was held for very short periods of time, we wouldn't have been able to invest it over a very long time horizon. But in terms of making a return, we could have made a return, but market conditions, which we've sort of alluded to, effectively meant that very short-dated investments, or even investments over 3 to 6 months, were effectively generating next to zero in terms of returns. And it's at some points through the financial year, the government's debt management office, which is effectively our last port of call for investments, at some points in time their interest rates actually turned negative. I hasten to add that we had no investments during the year where negative interest rates was applied to us. So effectively the main overriding concern for us in terms of that money was ensuring that it was kept safely, and that it was easy to access in terms of being able to access it as and when we needed to make the payments out to businesses.
Thank you, David. My next question is 17.3, where it talks about the liquidity. It says, in addition, the council aims to hold a minimum of 10 million readily available in same-day access bank accounts. How did we get to that 10 million figure, and how often is that figure reviewed?
I'll answer the second part first, because that's probably the easiest to answer. I mean, that is, we review that formally every year. So when the strategy goes to initially to cabinet to see first as part of the budget strategy, and then when council approve the budget strategy, including the treasury management strategy in February, we take the opportunity to review that sum of money. That sum of money is, in terms of the calculation of it, there isn't a detailed calculation for it. It is just a rough estimate. It's there just to ensure that if there are any very short notice liabilities that come to light for the council, that we have that money that we can access effectively within a day. The challenge over the last year in particular, and perhaps even slightly prior to COVID rearing its head, is that the opportunities to invest money over a month, 3 months, 6 months, the rates of return on those kinds of investments have been very there's been very little benefit, if you like, in terms of tying your money up for longer. So we have far exceeded having that level of liquidity through the year. Liquidity hasn't been an issue for us. It's the issue really is the fact that there's a lack of return to be had out there, and then ensuring that our money is invested and held safely, so that we have a wide range of counterparties and investments that we're holding our money in throughout the year. So that's where the challenge has been. Unfortunately, the trying to generate a return in the current circumstances, or the circumstances that we saw last year and into this year, has taken a back seat to those two priorities of security and liquidity.
Okay, thank you. Members, are there any questions? I'll take the silence as a no, so that was to note and to comment on. Thank you very much for your work on that, David. And I think we will get another presentation from you in 6 months' time, or is it a year's time?
Well, I don't know if this is good or bad news for you, Chairman, but I think closer to 6 weeks, I think, in terms of the mid-year review follows hot on the heels of this. So that will be when we talk about what's happened this current financial year and what our expectations are for the remainder of the financial year.
Okay, thank you, David. Members, if we move on now to agenda item 8, which is value for money, if I hand over to the officer who's going to present this, please.
Hello, morning members. My name's Becky Forrester. I'm business partner for corporate services. So just to give you a quick introduction, unless Councillor Wharf wants to say a few introductory words.
Thank you, Becky. I did, but I will leave the heavy lifting to your good self. This does come, Councillor Peter Wharf, Deputy Leader and Cabinet Member for Corporate Development. I want members, and particularly members of the public, to be quite aware that we do put a huge amount of effort into achieving value for money when we construct our budgets and when we monitor our budgets. But there was a suggestion both by your good selves as an audit committee and from the peer review for finance that we should put effort into having individual targeted value for money exercises to ensure that as an organisation we achieve value for money, both in terms of preparation of the budget and in terms of comparison with other similar authorities. So this is at the early stages. We are now embarking upon this with some enthusiasm. I have to say the employees are extremely enthusiastic about it, and I look forward to this committee reviewing the process that we've set up so that we can continue. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks, Councillor Wharf. So this report follows a report that went to the Cabinet in October 2020, and the discussion there about the importance of embedding a robust and consistent approach to value for money, as Councillor Wharf has mentioned. The progress has been hindered slightly for obvious reasons, but has been given also greater momentum as a result of the peer review, which again Councillor Wharf mentioned, and which will be reported to the Cabinet next month in October. So our starting point essentially, and just by way of a reminder really, is that we need to be reviewing all our services against, in terms of comparison, so performance, cost and value for money. We need to be looking through the lens of challenge and whether we're challenging ourselves as to whether we are best placed to be providing those services. So what our delivery model is essentially for those services. We need to be consulting. That's a really key component of this with whoever the user of the service are, whether they be internal and external, or external, obviously could be both. So getting a handle on benchmarking is going to be really important and a key part of this exercise going forward. And there are 4 dimensions really that we need to be looking through as we go through that benchmarking exercise, which is set out in the report. So there's the kind of economic angle or the cost angle, so making sure that we're spending less where we can spend less, efficiency, which is about spending well, effectiveness, which is about spending wisely, and equity, which is about spending fairly. So those are the kind of different lenses, if you like, that I think come together to form our approach to value for money. And there's 2 dummy examples of how that data might be visualised in the report in front of you. We've had some very helpful support from the South West Audit Partnership, which was mentioned earlier in your meeting, to undertake a questionnaire, actually trying to do some evidence gathering with services, which was really very helpful. And as Councillor Wolf said, we've got some really good and useful feedback from that exercise. More specifically, what we got from that exercise was a commitment from 9 service areas to work with us in corporate services as pilot areas to develop our approach to value for money, recognising that there's sadly nothing kind of off the shelf that can be obtained. And those 9 officers have identified 5 which we feel will give a reasonable spread across the activities of the whole council. So they are, as listed in your report, highways, waste, adults brokerage, children's commissioning and ICT operations. I think there's been a bit of concern, which I share, about our ability in terms of our resourcing to do all of those 5 at the same time. I think nature will kind of rationalise those for us, in as much as waste have done a value for money exercise relatively recently, which we need to get our heads around before we start looking to do anything additional there. Highways are in the process of working with the South West Audit Partnership in a similar vein. So I think both of those would be we will want to come back to when we understand what's already happened. So I think in that way we probably, as I say, circumstance has rationalised to ICT operations, children's commissioning and adults brokerage in the first instance. So the recommendation is whether you support that approach, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, members. First one from Councillor Biggs.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the addition of the equity part of the equation. I think it's something that perhaps, I think with highways will be really interesting. You know, are they going to consult with disability groups, parents who need to get youngsters to school, public safety within our car parks, you know, are they lit appropriately, that sort of thing? Because I don't think, and perhaps I'm straying off the field, that perhaps that's always taken into account. You know, its focus always seems to be on road safety, whereas pavements are way down the sort of pecking order. And this might change things if it's done properly. We may need to look at it and say, are the controls there to really make sure that we prioritise our networks correctly? Obviously, we've got the legal and statutory requirements, but there may be areas that we're missing and that are used by many of our sort of underreported users. You know, they're not all car drivers, there's people with a lot of pedestrian usage, and I just hope that this will pick this up as with one of the 5 focus areas is highways. Are they going to do that, I suppose, is my question.
I don't know, Becky, or if Peter wants to try and answer that one.
I'm happy to try, Chairman, unless I'm interrupted by Councillor Wolf. Obviously John Selgren is on the call, I think, still, so in the meeting rather, sorry, so he will have heard that for himself, but I can feed that back into the process. My understanding is that the terms of reference of that audit haven't yet been drafted, so that's good timing, in as much as obviously as officers we can make sure that's fed in.
Can I add that that's thank you for that suggestion. That's really useful. And I think what it does is it brings to the heart of this matter that value for money is actually not just about money, it's about value to the organisation. And I assume that will be a characteristic that will be considered. It's a bit early days, but I think it's a great suggestion, and we need to recognise that there will be competing requirements chasing what we're doing. I would be interested to know what the Executive Director for Place, John Selgren, thought about that.
John?
Yeah, if I may, thank you. Yes, fine with that suggestion. What I would observe, just to pick up Councillor Wolf's comment, of course, value for money, as we know, is economy, efficiency and effectiveness, particularly that latter one, focusing on the service delivery and outcome. But yeah, happy to take away the proposal from this morning, Chairman.
Thank you, John. I don't see any other questions coming through, so I just would like to check either Peter or Becky. What sort of time frame have you got in mind for the completion of this? And will you be bringing this back to us as a committee, or will it go to Cabinet, or is there a scrutiny element? How do you foresee this going through the system?
I'm happy for Becky to answer most of that, but the purpose of today was to get you to agree to the principle and the process rather than to review timescales, because I think there is still work to be done in terms of working out what we should do in what order. And Becky will know that I'm actually quite keen that we do a limited number well, learn lessons in order to be able to incorporate those lessons into further exercises, because I'm of the view that we don't know what we don't know in this, and rather than assuming we do, we should do a few well and then say, oh, that's interesting, the way we should do them in future is this, that, the other. So that's slightly dodged your question, but I think, you know, the answer is I don't know. I don't know if Becky's got an idea of timescales, and if she has, she's welcome to. But I think the key thing is that your committee is to do with the process rather than the timescales. Certainly not yet. I mean, if you wanted to review at a later date how long we'd taken and was that a reasonable use of resources, that again I think would be a good use of Audit's money, time, effort. Thanks.
I think Bridget Downton, you want to come in?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, and in terms of where the findings go, I think that depends. Sorry, Chairman, I didn't introduce myself. Bridget Downton, Head of Chief Exec's Office. I think it depends a bit on the findings. So some of the outcomes from these reviews will be useful in a range of settings. They'll be useful in terms of thinking about budget setting and so on. They may also throw up issues around policy, which would then need to go through an overview process if in our comparisons we discover something that means we might want to change the way that we do things or our policy in relation to specific service areas. We might take that through an overview committee. Similarly, we might come across things that merit some scrutiny, so we might then want to programme that onto a scrutiny forward plan. So I guess, Chairman, in answer to your question, it depends a bit what the findings of the review will be, but Councillor Wolf's right in that this committee's role, as you know, is to agree the approach and the method, but it's a really good question that we do need to give some thought to moving forward about what the output of this, where that needs to go. So it depends on what we find, I think, Chairman.
Yeah, I think also, Bridget, Peter mentions what I think is quite an important position for this committee, is at some point that we do need to check what has happened and whether that was the right way of doing things. The reasoning behind my question of a timeline is because, in essence, as chairman of this committee, I don't know whether to chase you in 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, or what. Now, I appreciate this is a moving beast, but in some respects, I would, even if it's just a one-liner email from you, I do need to be kept somewhat in the loop, because I do want this process to work. I think Peter is really right that we need to do a few things, do it well, learn the lessons, move forward and continue on. But there needs to be a checking of that process. But I don't want to be, for want of a better word, annoying people by keep saying, have you done, have you done, have you done, have you done? So it would be useful just to be kept in the loop to begin with.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I think that's absolutely right, and we'll take this away and have a think, because I'm not aware of all of the things that come in front of you when, but it seems to me that some sort of regular update incorporated into something else that's coming to you about where we're at in the programme and so on would be useful. So let me have a think about that with Becky, and we'll come back to you with a proposal, Chairman.
Brilliant, thank you. Question, I think, for Jonathan Mayer. Jonathan, we got obviously 2 recommendations here. The first one is to note the developments, which is easily done. The second one, which is to agree the 5 pilots. I presume we will need a vote on this. Can you confirm that? And who am I proposing that this is a minded decision to, i.e. which officer?
Chairman, I think you will need to go to a vote on this one. And yes, it would be the committee expressing a view of what it would have been minded to decide if you'd been meeting in person. And I think in this instance, it's probably me as the decision maker for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. In that case, members, I'm quite happy to propose these 5 points for value for money review to be undertaken in A, waste services, B, highways, C, adults brokerage, D, children's commissioning, and E, ICT operations. Do I have a seconder for that?
I'm happy to second it, Councillor Susan Coppin.
Thank you, Susan. Can I ask Councillor Rod Atkins, are you in favour of this?
In favour, yes.
Thank you. Councillor Janet Dover?
In favour, Chair.
Councillor Mike Parks? We appear to have lost Mike at the moment. Councillor John Orell?
In favour.
Thank you. Councillor Richard Biggs?
In favour.
Jonathan, I think that is passed unanimously. Thank you.
Chairman, in that case, having heard your debate this morning, having heard the unanimous view of the committee, my decision is to agree that the 5 pilot value for money reviews listed in the report should be undertaken. Thank you. And as usual, it does feel uncomfortable and awkward, an officer having to make that decision on your behalf. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, members. We will now move on to agenda item 9, which is the review of agency and consultancy spend. I believe that is Officer Christopher Matthews, am I right? In conjunction with Peter Wharf?
Thank you, Chairman. I think it will be myself first, David McIntosh and Christopher, and then John Selgren. That will be the batting order for today. And if I can just very briefly, can I, this sounds sycophantic, but it's not meant to be. Can I thank you for bringing this to our attention and to my attention specifically a few months ago? It was extremely useful because it forced me and the organisation to put some effort into reviewing our agency spend and to looking at the various areas. And it's been really useful because as we came to the end of the pandemic, only in terms of we started to try and think about going back to our day job, we started to look at this area, reminded by your good self, and I am grateful. I know that David McIntosh, Corporate Director for HR, and Chris Matthews, HR, are going to talk about this in some detail. And then we thought what would be good for this committee, because obviously the agency spend, the report talks about the principles, but they cut across the whole of the organisation. And so John Selgren has very helpfully offered to talk through the agency spend within his area, which may be quite a large number, but there are a whole series of reasons which John will explain, which will, I think, explain and, dare I say, educate the committee as to what and where. I don't think we've got time to go through every single directorate, but I'm hoping that at the end of this you will be happy with the process, and I leave it to you to call other directorates to talk to you in due course to explain their area. But I think this will give you some really good input as to what's going on. And with that, with your approval, I'll hand over to David McIntosh. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Good morning, members. I'm just going to take you, as Peter says, through the sort of the main points of the report and the work that's been done to date. Pause perhaps and just ask Chris Matthews if he wants to add to anything, and then refer, as Peter says, with your permission, Chair, to John Selgren. So I'm David McIntosh. I'm the Corporate Director for HR and OD. And with Chris Matthews, the Service Manager for HR Operations, have been supporting directorates in reviewing their use of agency spend. The agency workers make up an important part of the Council's workforce. The reasons that we might use them are set out in the report. So they may be, for example, issues of national skill shortages, and obviously that's a very topical thing at the moment. It's already been mentioned in your meeting earlier today about some of the current pressures, but there are long-standing national skill shortages in a number of local government professional areas. There's obviously issues of potential sickness absence and posts needing to be covered at short notice. There are potential workload pressures in certain areas, and then there is from time to time the need for specialist skills to be brought in, so beyond what we have within our employed workforce. And we tend to increasingly use the reference to agency workers, but just to be clear, Chair, that sometimes when we talk about agency workers, they would probably be better known as consultants in some cases, because they're doing that type of work, and that might be most applicable when it's specialist skills. So over the last period, working with directorates, we've carried out a review with two main purposes, really: to check and hopefully today provide you with assurance that the use of agency workers is part of a resourcing strategy, and so that we understand why we are engaging agency workers, and also that we make sure that the spend, as much as possible, is within the commensurate contract. So Chris can talk more in detail about the commensurate contract if you wish, Chair. But just briefly, that's the Council's procured source of agency workers, and it allows us to engage people from a number of different sources under that umbrella contract and make sure that we are compliant. Not all spend is necessarily within the commensurate contract, and the tables within the report break down the spend. But we're clearly keen to get as much within commensurate as we can from a procurement point of view. So the outcomes of the work that we've done, and hopefully this will be illustrated in some of the comments that John Selgren will make, is that the spend outside of the commensurate contract is lower than it was, which is a positive outcome. And there's also been a renewed clarity about the use of agency workers, and including some reduction in the average length of agency worker assignments across the piece when we look at the numbers across the board. So with that introduction, Chair, if I may, with your permission, I'll just pause there and ask if Chris wanted to add anything before we hear from John.
Thank you. Nothing really else to add unless there are any particular comments around the commensurate contract, as David said. But the only comment for me really is that I think the latest figures, and we provided you with 5 quarters of figures intentionally, because we wanted to be able to draw a comparison between the quarter 1 of 2021 and the quarter 1 of this financial year. The lack of change in those results and outputs do not probably reflect the amount of additional work and effort that's gone in to make sure we've got a far greater understanding of cost, visibility of cost, and a real push to ensure that, as David has already mentioned, there's a line to the workforce strategy there, and that use of agency workers and consultants is only where absolutely necessary. So I think some of that is influenced clearly by demand around areas that David's already articulated, and other aspects related to COVID as well.
I think it's over to you now, John, I think.
Thank you, Chairman, and again, thank you for that opportunity to talk a bit about the work on this in the Place Directorate, which I hope will just, as David's indicated, just bring that alive for members using West Place as a case study. I would observe, and we had a chat in the senior leadership team last week about this presentation. My colleagues in People's, the executive directors for People's and Children's, both made the comment that that what I will share with you this morning is replicated in their own directorates. For example, in things like the use of agency social workers. But we felt probably the place services perhaps were a better way of illustrating the issues for the councils. Perhaps these are the services that you'll be very familiar as they're very front facing, very much in the public eye. I think the first comment I'd make to the committee is that the use of agency staff itself is not innately a bad thing. And the reason I say that is because I think there are a number of benefits, and when I just walk you through a few examples, I think you'll share why I can confidently make that statement. So in a service like waste, for example, if a member of staff is off sick, that round still needs to be completed. So bringing in agency staff at that point will enable us to do that, and that's why in a service like waste it has and continues to be a useful one, which we complement our resources, particularly to do things like cover sickness. And of course, the alternative committee members would be aware would be to have effectively additional staff on the payroll. So that would be the other way you could deal with it, but the use of agency in an efficient and well managed way is a good way of dealing with those sorts of short-term depletion of staff resources. So it's that benefit to be able to bring people in quickly and at relatively short notice, and that's where the commensurate contract has become particularly relevant. So it's through that mechanism that this is controlled. It's not simply about reaching out to the market, but the council has a contract with commensurate. And in questioning, Chris Matthews may want to say a little bit more about this, but that effectively controls the rates that we pay and certainly gives reassurance to members and indeed to the taxpayer that ultimately when we do use agency staff, we do that in a value for money way. The other situation in which agency staff are very useful is where we get backlogs, and a recent example of that within the place structure would be in planning, where particularly in terms of verification, we did have a short-term backlog, and we used agency staff quite consciously to help us with that. Again, that backlog mercifully was temporary, and it's a good example again of having that flexible resource. We don't need in perpetuity that volume of staff on the payroll, and therefore agency staff help deal with a particular problem. We had a moment in time. Now that's been addressed, those agency staff can be released, and we get back to the standard operating establishment size. So again, it's a cost-effective solution to deal with that need for short-term flexibility. And then the other one that Councillor Wharf made reference to in his opening comments are where we have staff who we bring on agency basis, as has been said, normally would be known as consultants, where these bring particular professional expertise or skill sets that again we don't have from our own staff complement. And again, that's a really good example because it means we can access those specialist and technical skills for the duration and time that we need them, again without having to retain those as part of our regular workforce complement. So again, it's a really useful resource and tool to be able to, over that short-term period, be able to do the work we need to do without raising the overall size of the council's payroll budget. So for the reasons I said, that's why the council has that agency contract in place through commensurate. In terms of the work that we did in place, and again, I had hoped to have my business partner Alison Wright with us this morning, because in fairness, Alison has done all of the work on this, and I would just want to publicly acknowledge the work that she and her team have done to support us in place in dealing with this issue. But when we began to look in a bit more detail at our use of agency staff, it became apparent that the message had not necessarily reached all parts of the directorate about the existence and indeed reach of the commensurate contract. So a lot of us coming back into full compliance has been about making sure that all parts of the directorate were aware, and we're using that framework arrangement to ensure the council secures value for money. So I focus on the detail. Over the last 18 months, we've been reviewing agency spend with our heads of service and making sure they are aware of how we use and the correct method to draw on the use of agency staff. And as a result of that, since Q1 of 2020, within the directorate, we've reduced our spend on agency staff by about 35%. So that's a third reduction in the use of agency staff. And that's particularly been by looking at some of the areas that use agency staff or have used agency staff extensively in the past, notably in planning and waste. Because one of the benefits, and again, Chairman, as Councillor Wharf, I would like to pay tribute to the committee for raising this issue with all of us, because it has meant we've been able to spend time getting this focus and rigour into the system. But what we've been able to do in areas like planning and waste in particular is to look at where we're using agency staff and to carry out that review to question ourselves about whether this is in fact a base load of the workforce. In other words, that we need to have sufficient staff on the payroll to carry out that day-to-day work, and to make sure that our use of agency staffing is used in the circumstances that I described a moment ago. And we're now monitoring that agency staff on a quarterly basis. Again, the report you've got before you this morning demonstrates the outcome of that across the whole organisation. But again, Chairman, I'd observe that that quarterly reporting, I think, has put a discipline into the system that ensures that we are using agency staff only in those appropriate circumstances, and indeed, and in particular, that all of that is compliant with the commensurate contract to ensure that we're getting value for money. The other area, and again, my colleagues may want to say a little bit more about this, because there were two aspects to the compliance. The first was to make sure that we were being efficient and effective in the use of agency staff. We were only using them for short periods for the reasons that we've identified earlier, but also that spend is compliant with what is known as IR35. And some members will know IR35 is an HMRC regulation to make sure that all of those people are being employed in this way. Their arrangements in terms of their personal taxation position are regularised and appropriately recorded and notified to the HMRC. I'm pleased to say, Chairman, that the level of non-compliant IR35 spend in the Directorate was very, very small indeed. And I can confirm that all of our spend is now compliant with IR35. And again, Chairman, that's one of the benefits of using the commensurate contract, because it brings the assurance of IR35 compliance, which is important from a legal point of view. This is something that the HMRC take very, very seriously indeed, to avoid some of those things that were seen some years ago, certainly not by this council necessarily, but by many others, not just in the public sector, but more widely around what became known as off payroll contracts. So I say the summary I would make, Chairman, is that the commensurate contract has proved to be a really useful way of ensuring that value for money is controlled. The way in which you've asked us to review that has certainly been helpful to make sure that we're doing that within the Directorate. And again, as I said, my third point, Chairman, is that the existence of the commensurate contract ensures that Dorset Council has and remains compliant with IR35. I hope members have found that helpful.
Thank you all for this. It's really helpful, and it certainly addresses a number of the concerns that I had. But I want to raise, I think, 2 points. The first one is, and particularly when, as has been used this time, the word consultants is used. Perception, I think, within the wider community is that the pound signs start rolling. And I think what we need to do as a council, if we're going to use the term consultancy, we have to be specific about why it is we're using the consultants, how much potentially extra it is to have a consultant as opposed to employing somebody, because I don't think otherwise we will successfully address that issue with the wider public. The second point that I want to raise, and it's one which is very home to me at this precise moment, and I hope you'll understand where I'm coming from. There is an issue across, I think, public sector of the necessary qualified staff to be able to fill vacancies. So one that you mentioned, John, for example, is in planning. So and I hope you see where I'm coming from. So Dorset Council is potentially short of planners, a hypothetical question. So it goes through the process of advertising for staff. So you get, for example, the job description, etc. on the Dorset Council website. Nobody suitable applies for that position. Dorset Council then, because it needs the work to be done, employs agency staff to fulfil those roles. The job advert disappears, but Dorset Council is potentially still short of staff. And as I say, I'll give you a real life example. As Peter Wharf will know, I start this Thursday a degree in planning. I am already looking through the system with regards to where job vacancies potentially are. And one council to the north of us, despite however many times I look, there is never a job advertised. Therefore, I will never potentially go back to that council to potentially look for a job. But they might have vacancies, but they're not advertising them because they're using agency staff to fill. Do you see where I'm coming from? I think there is a need that if we are short of specific qualified, we need to keep a rolling advert going so that we fulfill with long-term staff rather than agency staff who may come in all sorts of guises, all sorts of costs, etc. I just think it's something that we need to address as a council. If we are truly in a situation in this nation where there is a gulf between the need for qualified staff and the actual qualified staff out there, we need to make sure that we keep trying to encourage people to Dorset. I don't know if anybody wants to make any comments to that.
Yeah, Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry, Councillor Wolf, I think perhaps wants to.
Thank you, Chairman, thank you for those heartfelt comments. There was an advert went out for planners a couple of weeks ago, I know, for Dorset Council. There's 2 or 3 things I think we need to do, and I just want to answer that and a couple of other questions. The business partners need to emphasise to the directors of all of the directorates that they mustn't slip into using consultants rather than going through the hard work of recruitment, which is the sort of way I'm reading what you're saying. And I look at Chris Matthews and he's nodding, and I think we need to re-emphasise to all business partners, because it's quite easy to slip into this rather than slip out of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what you're looking at today, and I've got another screen in front of me, and I'm looking at the spreadsheets by directorate, by quarters of the spend, and you've had a detailed analysis by the place executive director of the spend for that area. So from my point of view, what I'm looking for is you to be comfortable with the layout of this report, and you to, if you want to, investigate other directorates at various times to suit you. But my first question is, I want to make sure that we've given you the information you want, because what I don't want is to come back again and find it doesn't provide you with what you want. Now, I am very pleased with it, and I think Chris Matthews and his team have done a fantastic job, because it's detailed but not overpowering in terms of, you know, 1 million pages. I think it gives you enough. So that's one of my questions. My second question is, well, it's not really a question, it's a comment, which says, I'm assuming that you will, okay, we've looked at place today, you may choose to look at other areas at some stage when convenient to you to investigate and drill down into a bit of detail. And my third point is that by drilling down into detail, which you will do, I suggest now and again, you will achieve exactly what you want to achieve, which is to try and make sure that people do not drift into various, because it's actually quite easy to drift. And if you've talked about, you've just started a degree, and you and I have talked about this. I went to London as a consultant on a very, very large multi-billion pound project, and I went to give them a week's advice. I charged them the rate for a week. I was there 18 months later, and we, you know, that's A, because they get comfortable with people, and B, because I was giving them what they want. But actually what they should have done is after a little while say, look, you either need to be permanent or you need to go. Now we need to be much more robust on that, and Chris Matthews has indicated that he'd like to come in. So that's one thing I'd like the business partners to do, and you will help by having regular constructive drill downs into each of the area. Thank you, Chairman.
Yes, Chris.
Thank you. Just 2 points on the issue that you raised around a sort of long-term use and dependency of agency workers when we should be actively looking to recruit, if I may, and to give you some assurance. One is around the length of bookings and the active process or monitoring we put in place of the length of bookings, and Councillor Wolf has already highlighted the spreadsheet that he's got access to, and we do regularly report to senior leadership team and each directorate leadership team on the length of bookings, and make sure that there is a review of bookings in place to make sure that it continues to be the right way to engage people. The second thing is to highlight that in certain areas we do exactly what you've said around the use of rolling adverts. It's something we as a council have been doing now for a couple of years around social workers. We know there's a national shortage of both adults and children's social workers, so we do have an active recruitment page for those areas and a rolling process of people applying and being considered for roles through that route. So that is something we have done in that area, and it is something that we can extend and expand in areas such as planning if we deem there to be a necessity to do so.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Peter. To answer your question, does the report give what I was after? I think in general it does. And I would personally, because we're talking about budget lines, I would like this to come back every so often to make sure and we're keeping tabs of what's happening, and then be able to highlight trends if there are certain issues within certain directorates. I think, unless I've missed it, one thing that would be very helpful to know is, what are agency costs? You know, what is the on top costs? And I think in many respects that would be quite useful to know, because I don't know whether it's a flat fee, whether it's a percentage of salary. I've got no idea, and it would be very helpful to actually have that type of information available. And as I say, I apologise if I missed it in all the data. David, did you want to come in with something there?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to respond to that point, if we report back to you periodically, we can include in the next report some information about how agency workers are remunerated, and in the kind of whole range of them, because there are some examples, and we can cover this next time perhaps, but there are some examples where on the face of it, it would seem to be more expensive, but actually when you look at it, a genuine comparison, it's perhaps similar to the cost of employing somebody directly. So as I say, on the surface, it can look as if we're employing agency workers at a higher cost, when actually, in fact, that's not always the case.
Yeah.
So happily clarify that the next time for you.
Yeah.
It would be helpful, Chair, just to get your steer on how often you would want to see this. I think one of my reflections on the work that we've done is that this work doesn't move particularly quickly, because part of the exercise is to talk to existing agency workers to try to sell them the benefits of being on the council, in the council's employment, and that's not necessarily, those aren't necessarily quick conversations. So the trends, I think, are sort of medium to longer term rather than short term. So that would, a year always sounds like a long time, doesn't it? But you know, I would suggest it would be at least 6 months, perhaps, to a year, for us to report back. But clearly, take your steer on that.
Thank you, David. I mean, in answer to your first one, yes, please. In answer to your second one, I was thinking yearly. Unless you, in your position within the council, see something that warrants investigation sooner, otherwise, yes, a yearly one, please. Question from Councillor Susan Cocking.
It's okay, Chair, because you just asked the question. It was about agency costs. I wanted to know how much it was actually costing the council and the council taxpayer for the agency fee. So you beat me to it.
I apologise. Thank you all very much. I don't see any further questions coming through. Thank you very much, Peter, for taking this on board when I first raised it with you. And yes, we will be looking at other directorates within the near future, but Place really was definitely the obvious place to start because of the length and breadth of the directorate, as it were. So thank you all very much for your time. That moves us on to agenda item number 10, which is the forward plan. Does any member have any comments on the forward plan? Or does any officer have any comments on the forward plan? I'll take the silence as a no. Susan Dallison, if you and I could speak at some point about arranging for the other directorates to do a presentation with regards to agency staff, I would appreciate that. And I've just seen on the screen that Aidan, you wish to add something to the forward plan?
Yeah, just a quick one. We've got next week at Cabinet, there'll be a paper reporting the finance peer review that took place, organised by the LGA earlier in the summer. And connected to that, we've published, or we'll be publishing an action plan, and subject to Council's agreement or Cabinet's agreement, we'd be keen for the Audit Committee to monitor the implementation and to oversee the implementation of that finance improvement plan. So I'd be looking if we could, subject to Cabinet approval next week, if we could put that on the forward plan probably early in the new year, if that's possible, when we've been able to make good progress.
Yeah, I can't see a problem with that. If you could touch base with Susan after the Cabinet meeting, and we can get that into the forward plan. While you're on, Aidan, before you disappear, I did make a couple of notes with regards to the risk management report that David Trotter did earlier. And if you've got a pen and paper to hand, I did notice a couple I thought were perhaps for Audit to look at. So if you could perhaps have a peruse over that and see whether you think there is an update that is worthy to provide to us as a committee. So those risks are number 272, 212, 344, 316 and 326. Just have a look through those when you have a mo, and see whether you think it's something that we can address through this committee. Thank you all very much for that. Agenda item 11 is urgent business, which I don't believe there is any. Is that right, Susan?
Correct, no urgent business, Chairman.
And I believe agenda item 12, exempt business, there is no exempt business.
Correct.
Can I just confirm, Susan, that members have got a presentation by swap on a different Teams invite? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Chairman. If members can leave this meeting, there's a separate invitation to the swap presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you all members and officers for today. A really good meeting, really helpful. And members, I hope to see you shortly on the presentation from swap. Thank you all. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman.